The Tet Offensive was launched on the 30th of January 1968 by the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong, depending on what you want to call them. It was one of the largest military campaigns of the Vietnam War. The idea was it was a campaign of surprise attacks against military and civilian command and control centres throughout Vietnam. And the aim of it was to destabilise the southern regime and encourage the people to rise up against the Americans and the South Vietnamese government. The first major attack was, or should I say phase one, came during the Tet holiday, hence why it's called the Tet Offensive. The Vietnamese also did something very similar, an attack on the Tet holiday years previously. I'm talking like centuries ago against the Chinese. More than 100 cities were attacked, particularly in 1st and 2nd Tactical Corps. It was an attempt to cause rebellion amongst the South Vietnamese population and encourage the US to scale back its involvement in Vietnam. One of the reasons why the event was so successful was because although the US and South Vietnamese forces held off the attacks, news coverage of the offensive shocked the American public and eroded support of the war effort. And I'll move on to something later known as a couple of photographs, which were very influential in changing the opinion of the war at home. Tet would also define the notion of a military victory becoming a political disaster, as you will later see. Despite heavy casualties, North Vietnam did actually have some success with it, and the idea of this little bit is just to explain to you what happened. Now, a bit of background for you. The North Vietnamese Politburo was split between increasing military action and maintaining the present course and suing for peace. Basically, from the 1960s onwards, you have two different factions. You have the war faction, you have the peace faction. The war faction are a bunch of Vietnamese who really haven't fought in the First Indochina War and are namely influenced by the Maoist thought process that you can't have communist takeovers peacefully, you must use war, as Mao did in China. And you have the peaceful diplomacy kind of guys, which includes a guy called General Giap, who's important in the First Indochina War. And the idea of this is that they do not want to fight because they know what fighting does to the country. But however, they were seen as basically a load of old fogies who didn't have a clue. US and ARVN intelligence noticed a huge increase in trucks going from Laos into Vietnam from the Ho Chi Minh Trail, from 480 before October 1967, 1,116 in October 1967, 3,823 in November, 6,315 in December. Also, this led them to believe that there was an attack coming. Also, there were loads of conflict between the US and the North Vietnamese army in what's called the border battles, which are basically battles along the border, hence what's called the border battles. Intelligence was confused of why the NVA were fighting in areas where the US could use heavy artillery. Basically, the North Vietnamese were very good at picking locations, and the Viet Cong, where the Americans would be limited, so, jungle areas that suited guerrilla warfare. But the NVA were fighting in areas where the US could use heavy artillery. It's just like, you can tell something's off, and the idea was to distract them. And Lieutenant General Frederick Whalen was suspicious and moved 15 US battalions from the city of Saigon 15 US battalions to the city of Saigon and surrounding areas, would probably save the US from complete annihilation at Tet. The thing was, because all these North Vietnamese were spotted in the north of the country, the generals in the US generals wanted to move troops out of Saigon and the surrounding areas, to where the attacks were taking place. In particular, there's a military base called Khe Sanh, which was attacked at one point. And Whalen said, well, no, this might be a complete decoy. And one of the things the US knew was that in 1953, when Geneva Peace Accords were taking place, the Vietnamese, decided to attack Dien Bien Phu so they could win a strategic victory before the peace negotiations. This is what they thought might happen again. However, they were both US and South Vietnamese top-ranking officials found the idea of an attack on Tet doubtful. Reason being was that it is a sacred holiday, and you don't really attack on a sacred holiday. In addition, almost half the South Vietnamese forces were on leave for the holiday. It's a bit like the French invading us on Christmas Day. It's that kind of thing. Another factor was the peace talks were under consideration, so they didn't think anything would happen. Just after midnight on the 30th of January 1968, major cities in Second Corps and Da Nang in the First Corps were attacked. At 3 in the morning, the main NVA and VC attacks took place. Many were repelled. The interesting thing was because the South Vietnamese forces had to fight, many did so very well. Obviously, it depended on the commander, but some were incredibly successful, others were less successful. And the interesting thing is no ARVN forces did defect, which is kind of an important aspect, which showed that the North Vietnamese plan of getting the people to rise up, even the military weren't doing it, that kind of thing. There were 6 main targets in Saigon that they wanted to attack, but control of the city was not the aim. I'm only going to go through a few. The national radio station was to broadcast propaganda. They had a tape of a message that Ho Chi Minh had done, and the idea was that they'd play that message and all the families and households would see that Ho Chi Minh wants them to rise up against the US. Well, they got to the national radio station, they played the message, but the US had cut the wires to the radio station, so nobody actually heard it, which was kind of a bit pointless. Another aim was the US Embassy, which is an interesting building because it had only been designed in 1967. And so it kind of had if you imagine like a castle, it kind of had a outer wall and then an inner wall. Inside the inner wall was the embassy. And the Vietnamese used all their explosives to get into the section between the inner and the outer wall, and as a result they kind of got trapped and then were easily disposed of when the US returned at about 10 in the morning. The other interesting thing was that there was loads of photographers at this point that looked at the US Embassy and saw the embassy in Saigon being attacked, and this showed that the US were losing, because the idea was that they'd all been saying that the US were winning because of all these statistics showing Viet Cong dead, which actually any villager who was killed was counted as Viet Cong, so it was a bit dubious. But embassies, even today, are still seen as sovereign soil, so the fact that the US embassy had been attacked effectively said the Vietnamese had invaded America. It's almost like that. All in all, 8 provincial capitals and 5 of the 6 autonomous cities and 58 other major cities were stormed in Tet. It was big. It was properly big. Viet Cong members went around with blacklists of ARVN and government officials. One other group attacked the headquarters of the Vietnamese Navy. The idea was they wanted to kill lots of South Vietnamese officials, so they couldn't really do anything. Then we enter a little sideshow called Hue. Hue was a city where the Viet Cong invaded / North Vietnamese army, and they started killing a whole host of citizens there, including up to about 5,000 people, which discovered in mass graves. And the idea was that these were re-education camps, but the problem with Hue was that the Americans drastically underestimated the size of the Viet Cong forces there, so they were a bit confused really, and actually what they thought was something like 2,000 men was about 12,000 men, but it was incredibly bloody, it was horrendous, and obviously it gained publicity for the brutal massacre. However, it wasn't really till after the offensive that it gained publicity, because many reporters cared more about the events actually in Saigon. Khe Sanh Combat Base was actually, the offensive there started slightly before Tet but continued onwards. 6,000 US men were surrounded by 20,000 People's Army of Vietnam men, so North Vietnamese men, in which the US dropped 31,000 tons of ammunition, actually trying to destroy the Vietnamese because the US men were effectively under siege. Despite the pressure applied all over the country by the communist forces, none of them succeeded in the end, which is interesting that the North Vietnamese actually lost that, but they suffered around 45,000 casualties, so it was quite big. Now, the outline of the aftermath of the Tet Offensive is quite interesting, because you can really go down 2 schools of thought with it. You can go down the thought that Tet was a huge failure for the Americans, because the Americans have been saying for years, we're winning, we're killing all these Viet Cong, they'll never be able to launch another offensive, and yet they did, and it was quite successful, i.e. they did invade a lot of South Vietnam. But however, you can also look at it as it was a huge failure because all the attacks were repelled. There was no mass uprising against the government. And as a result, they failed. Also, the Viet Cong were also almost annihilated, would never play a major role in the war again. So pretty much the North Vietnamese army were the only people left to do the fighting. Now, the interesting thing is there was actually a idea that the North Vietnamese Politburo authorised Tet to try and get rid of a lot of the leaders of the Viet Cong, so therefore there isn't 2 groups competing for power in South Vietnam. And it's an interesting idea because as soon as the Viet Cong were gone, all the ex-Viet Cong members had to basically join the North Vietnamese army, and therefore they're under the command of the Politburo up there. After the embassy battle, reporters and news people were called in by General Westmoreland, and he said load of victory. However, the television reports basically stated not that, with ruined buildings, Vietnamese on the street, and in particular there's a picture of a Vietnamese officer shooting a Viet Cong member, which gained increasing publicity. Now, the real story isn't quite as clear-cut. It's to do with the fact that Viet Cong member killed his uncle or something, and that's why that's why he murdered him. But you can't tell that with the picture. Tet ended with 3,895 US troops dying and South Vietnamese losing about 5,000. Civilian casualties were much, much greater, with 14,000 dead, 24,000 wounded, and 800,000 lost their homes. And this is on top of however many were lost. Tet was important. It's changed perceptions of the Cold War, destroyed the American reputation they were world's best army, because Second World War, they won, they used the atom bomb. Korea War, they did actually save South Korea from communism. Vietnam, they lost, and, Tet does kind of show that, the Americans aren't the best. It also turned world attention to America at a time like other issues like racial inequalities were present. Martin Luther King is campaigning a lot through the 1960s, but also there is the increasing problem of the fact that a lot of black Americans were out in Vietnam dying for their country, and yet they didn't really have civil rights. So that was one of the things that really got the spotlight turned on it when world attention was on America. Deflected attention from the USSR as well. I mean, in 1968, they invaded Czechoslovakia under the Brezhnev Doctrine, and that was a huge thing that really didn't get a lot of attention because of the American problems in Vietnam. Also, it showed the US were not winning and encourages the US to do more secret action. In particular, the use of bombing into Laos and Cambodia, and particularly Cambodia, which leads to the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s, Pol Pot, Killing Fields, Year Zero, etc. It was mainly a psychological defeat and led to a decrease in American action across the world. And in the 1970s, there was more and more covert action into Chile and other places. In particular, with Chile, you end up with the CIA helping a guy called Pinochet get to power. And there was no actual military action taken by the US at all in the Cold War until the invasion of Grenada in 1983, which is much, much into the Reagan administration. Tet was a really significant turning point because the US government saw that the Tet Offensive as a reason to de-escalate the war, and in particular moving to 1969 when Nixon comes in and you end up with Vietnamization. But it could have been interesting had the American people believed that they'd won Tet, therefore they would have increased the amount of troops and they may have even invaded North Vietnam. However, when the public was leaked confidential documents about the war, the Pentagon Papers, with information including decision-making process during Tet, the public became more convinced the Vietnam War was a losing proposition. Westmoreland actually asked for more troops, but his request was just basically denied. They did not see the need in fighting for it. Lyndon B. Johnson even declined to run for president again. Battles could claim to affect the war greatly, but basically Tet was the main thing, which was the problem. And Tet eventually leads to the fall of South Vietnam. Thank you for listening.